April 8, 1943. At 27,000 feet over occupied northern France, the air was so thin that every breath had to pass through an oxygen mask. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190A5, a seasoned German fighter pilot narrowed his eyes and looked down. An Oberleutnant of Jagdgeschwader 26, he had flown over Poland, France, Britain, and the Eastern Front. He had fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, Yaks, and Lags, but what was climbing toward his formation that morning looked ridiculous. Large, bulky American aircraft were struggling upward through the early sunlight. Their bodies were bloated like oil drums, their wings seemed too small for their massive frames, and their cockpit canopies looked like greenhouses. They did not resemble fighters. They looked more like flying milk bottles. Laughter crackled over the radio. "The Americans have sent us flying milk jugs," he told his wingmen, unable to hide his mockery. To German pilots who had dominated the skies of Europe for nearly 4 years, this was not an opponent. It was a joke. Below them, 16 American P-47 Thunderbolts were clawing their way higher. Each aircraft weighed nearly 7 tons, powered by a 2,000-horsepower engine roaring in defiance of gravity itself. Through Luftwaffe eyes, they were too slow, too heavy, too crude to survive modern aerial combat. The outcome of the encounter seemed decided before it had even begun. But what the German pilots could not know, what no one in Europe could yet imagine, was that they were witnessing the birth of the most terrifying nightmare German aviation would ever face. Inside those mocked airframes were 850 caliber Browning machine guns, carrying a total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition. When fired together, they unleashed more than 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to tear a fighter aircraft apart in less than 2 seconds. This is not a story about elegant dogfights or individual tactical genius. It is a story about how industrial logic defeated battlefield brilliance, how mass production and brute force engineering crushed experience, skill, and pride. They laughed that morning, but within 18 months, no one was laughing anymore. And the question that follows is simple. How did an aircraft once dismissed as a joke, the P-47 Thunderbolt, go on to change the skies over Europe forever? The design philosophy of the P-47 Thunderbolt was not born from confidence, but from fear. In June 1940, as German forces crushed France in a matter of weeks, and Luftwaffe fighters dominated the skies over Europe, the United States Army Air Forces entered a state of emergency. Intelligence reports made one fact unmistakably clear. German fighters could operate effectively at high altitude, where existing American aircraft were nearly powerless. Washington issued an urgent demand for something entirely new, a high-altitude interceptor capable of meeting the Luftwaffe head-on. That mission fell to Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at Republic Aviation. Kartveli, born in Georgia and trained in the European engineering tradition, quickly recognized a fundamental truth. If the United States attempted to follow Germany's path, building small, lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters, it would always be one step behind. Instead, he chose a radically different approach, one that defied conventional wisdom. Kartveli did not want to build a nimble boxer. He wanted an armored gladiator. At the heart of this design was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a massive 18-cylinder power plant capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. But raw power alone was not enough. To maintain that power above 25,000 feet, where thin air caused conventional engines to choke, Kartveli integrated an extraordinarily complex turbo-supercharger system. Using exhaust gases routed through long ducts running along the rear fuselage, the system compressed incoming air before feeding it back into the engine, allowing the aircraft to perform as if it were still operating at sea level. The cost of this solution was an unusual and ungainly appearance. The fuselage became bulky, the tail elongated, and the aircraft's weight increased dramatically. Yet the trade-off was exceptional strength. The P-47 featured a heavily reinforced airframe, armor protecting critical components, and a level of damage tolerance unmatched by any contemporary fighter. It was not designed to circle endlessly in classic European-style dogfights. It was designed to survive being hit, climb above the enemy, then dive with tremendous speed and tear targets apart with overwhelming firepower. This philosophy, survive first, destroy second, laid the foundation for everything that followed. The P-47 was not a design mistake. It was the embodiment of a fundamentally different way of thinking about air warfare, one the Luftwaffe underestimated and ultimately paid for with control of the skies. If the P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster, the price of taming it was paid in blood. Before it ever became a nightmare for the Luftwaffe, this massive fighter had already become a source of fear within American units themselves. During the training period from late 1942 to early 1943, the P-47 was responsible for an alarming number of accidents. More than a few American pilots began to whisper that the aircraft was more dangerous to its own pilots than to the enemy. The Thunderbolt did not forgive mistakes. Its great weight and the enormous torque of its engine made it prone to torque roll on takeoff. A slight error in control input could flip the aircraft off the runway. On landing, its stiff landing gear and heavy inertia made ground loops common, especially among pilots still learning to manage its energy. Most dangerous of all was the dive. The P-47 accelerated so rapidly that many pilots encountered compressibility for the first time in aerial combat. Airflow compressing into shock waves over the wings, freezing the control surfaces and rendering the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. The consequences were severe. In just a few months of training, P-47 units lost dozens of aircraft and numerous pilots before ever encountering the enemy. At one point, the Thunderbolt was bitterly joked to be killing Americans faster than Germans. Even seasoned commanders initially expressed frustration, and in some cases outright hatred, toward the aircraft they viewed as crude, unforgiving, and difficult to fly. Once the Thunderbolt entered combat, its weaknesses became even more apparent. At medium altitudes, it could not turn as tightly as the Focke-Wulf 190, nor could it climb as sharply as the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In traditional dogfights, the P-47 was almost always at a disadvantage. German pilots quickly recognized this and exploited it aggressively, attacking from below and dragging Thunderbolts into prolonged turning engagements where weight became a lethal liability. Over Luftwaffe radio channels, mockery was constant. The P-47 was labeled a flying truck, a freight train with wings, even a pregnant cow. The early statistics seemed to confirm German confidence. In their first month of combat operations, American Thunderbolt units lost 14 aircraft while claiming only 3 confirmed German kills. At that moment, the P-47 appeared to be a costly mistake. But this period of failure created the lowest point of the story, the foundation from which a radical shift in understanding and employment of the Thunderbolt would ultimately reverse the balance of power in the skies over Europe. Amid the early failures and the laughter of the Luftwaffe, something strange was quietly unfolding. Something the Germans failed to notice. While many P-47s were shot down, those that survived returned to base in conditions that would have stunned any European fighter pilot. Their airframes were riddled like honeycombs, wings shredded, engine cowlings torn open, yet they were still flying. Some aircraft came back with more than 20 20mm cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage severe enough to have reduced a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire to falling debris. This was the first sign that the P-47 did not obey the familiar rules of European air combat. The heart of that difference lay in its air-cooled radial engine. Without a liquid cooling system, without coolant lines running through the fuselage, the fatal weak points of German fighters, the P-47 could absorb hits and keep going. A bullet passing through the aircraft no longer meant the engine would seize within seconds. Even with damaged cylinders, the engine could continue to roar, shaking violently, yet refusing to die. But durability was only half the story. The other half, and the truly dangerous part, revealed itself the moment a P-47 managed to bring its guns onto a target. When all 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns converged on a single point, the result was not a conventional shoot-down. It was total destruction. German aircraft did not spiral away and crash. They disintegrated. Wings were torn off, fuselages split in two, cockpits erased in storms of metal. What German pilots had never encountered before was the Thunderbolt's ability to sustain fire. While their cannons allowed only short, carefully rationed bursts, the P-47 could keep its trigger depressed for nearly 30 seconds, an absurdly long time in aerial combat, where engagements were usually decided in moments. 30 seconds was a lifetime, long enough to turn a brief mistake into a death sentence. Early reports describing Thunderbolts that refused to die were dismissed or quietly doubted. Yet these scattered signs were warning of a terrifying reality. The P-47 did not need elegant maneuvering. It only needed to survive long enough to shoot, and once it did, nothing in front of it remained. This was the first true warning, foreshadowing the legendary encounter to come, where the myth of the Thunderbolt's near invincibility would be permanently etched into the memory of both sides. June 26, 1943. The skies over northern France became the stage for one of the most implausible moments in the history of aerial warfare. A formation of 48 American P-47 Thunderbolts was returning from an escort mission when it was ambushed from above by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26. It was a textbook Luftwaffe attack, diving out of the sun with overwhelming speed and concentrated firepower. Robert S. Johnson, at the time a young second lieutenant with the 61st Fighter Squadron, was flying at the rear of the formation, the most vulnerable position. In the opening seconds, his Thunderbolt was caught in a crossfire from multiple directions. 20mm cannon shells detonated around the cockpit. The canopy shattered. Oil and hydraulic fluid flooded the cockpit. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson attempted to bail out, but when he reached for the canopy release, he realized the horrifying truth. The canopy was jammed shut. A cannon shell had exploded in the track, welding it in place. At 27,000 feet, Johnson was trapped inside a dying aircraft. The windscreen was coated in oil, leaving him nearly blind. The engine shook violently, sounding as if it might tear itself apart. The controls responded only intermittently. Under those conditions, any other fighter would have fallen from the sky. Yet Johnson managed to keep the P-47 flying and turned it toward the English Channel, toward home. Then the situation worsened. A lone FW-190 fell in behind him, recognizing the crippled Thunderbolt limping along at less than 170 miles per hour. The German pilot closed in and opened fire. The 20mm cannon thundered. Johnson could only huddle behind his armored seatback, waiting to die. But the P-47 kept flying. The cannon ran dry. The German switched to machine guns and fired until his ammunition was exhausted. Still, the Thunderbolt did not fall. In an almost unbelievable moment, the German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's aircraft. Through the shattered canopy, Johnson saw the young pilot's face, confidence giving way to confusion, then astonishment. The German shook his head, gave a brief military salute, and broke away. Johnson landed at Manston, his engine failing as the wheels touched the runway. Ground crews stopped counting bullet holes after passing 200. The aircraft that should never have survived had brought its pilot home. The story spread rapidly on both sides of the war. For the Americans, it became living proof of the P-47's extraordinary survivability. For the Germans, it planted the first seeds of doubt in the belief that the Thunderbolt was an easy kill. From that moment on, Mockery began to give way to unease, and soon, to fear. After the early losses, one unavoidable truth began to emerge. The problem was not the P-47 itself, but how it was being used. The Thunderbolt was never meant to be a fighter that won by turning tightly or outmaneuvering an opponent. It was an energy machine. And once American pilots learned to think in terms of energy rather than classical dogfighting instincts, the balance of power in the sky began to shift. Experienced U.S. commanders introduced a new set of rules: short, blunt, and absolute. Do not turn with the enemy. Do not climb at low altitude. Instead, pilots were told to use what the P-47 had in abundance: weight, power, and firepower. The Thunderbolt might lack agility, but it possessed exceptional energy retention. At high altitude, its engine maintained power, while its heavy airframe allowed it to accelerate in a dive faster than any German fighter. The new tactic was refined into a simple but deadly formula. Climb as high as possible, wait, then strike downward. From altitudes around 30,000 feet, a P-47 could dive at speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, so fast that many German pilots had no time to react. In that moment, the Thunderbolt was no longer a fat fighter, but a massive projectile hurled straight down from the stratosphere. After the dive, the P-47 did not stay to turn and fight. It converted speed back into altitude through a powerful zoom climb, pulling away to safety before the enemy could bring guns to bear. Then the cycle repeated: dive, fire, climb away. To American pilots, this was known as boom and zoom. To the Luftwaffe, in bitter hindsight, it earned another name: The Thunderbolt turkey shoot. For German pilots, the experience was utterly transformed. Instead of prolonged engagements, they faced only a few seconds of terror. When a P-47 opened fire, it was not a scattering of bullets, it was a count-to-wall of lead. The converging streams of heavy machine gun fire did not merely shoot aircraft down, they tore them apart in midair. There was no time to evade, no chance to recover from a mistake. This moment marked the most important transformation in the entire story. The P-47 was no longer a bad aircraft forced into the wrong role. When employed according to its true nature, the Thunderbolt became a weapon that was nearly impossible to counter, and the skies over Europe began to change hands. August 17, 1943, marked a true turning point in how the Luftwaffe perceived the P-47 Thunderbolt. During the dual Regensburg-Schweinfurt bombing mission, the U.S. Army Air Forces carried out the deepest escort penetration into German territory to date. This was no longer a series of scattered encounters over occupied France. It was a decisive test in the skies above Germany itself. And the Luftwaffe responded by deploying its specialized weapon, the heavy twin-engine Bf-110 fighters, the so-called bomber killers, armed with heavy cannon and firepower designed to tear B-17 flying fortresses apart in a matter of seconds. As the Bf-110 formations maneuvered into attack position, the P-47 escorts waiting above rolled over and dove. What followed was described by surviving German pilots as hammers falling from the sky. The Thunderbolts came down at terrifying speed. Cannon and machine gun fire from the Bf-110s opened up at long range, rounds striking P-47 wings and fuselages, yet the American fighters did not even wobble. They continued their dive as if untouched. Then the Thunderbolts fired back. In that moment, the full power of the .850 caliber Browning machine guns revealed itself, not as theory, but as mathematics made lethal. Each gun carried 425 rounds. 8 guns meant 3,400 rounds of ammunition, nearly 900 pounds of metal converted into firepower. At a typical convergence distance of around 300 yards, all ballistic paths intersected within a zone roughly 6 feet wide. Nearly 100 rounds per second slammed into a single point. The result was not a conventional shootdown. A Bf-110 hit by that fire did not spiral downward trailing smoke. It disintegrated. Wings separated from the fuselage. The tail was severed. The cockpit vanished in a storm of debris. A German gunner who survived the engagement later told interrogators, "The aircraft in front of us simply ceased to exist. It was not shot down. It was destroyed." American pilots quickly understood what they now possessed. One future ace described the sensation of firing all 8 guns. When you hit them with all 8, they don't have a chance. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, exploding in midair. This was not exaggeration. It was the inevitable outcome of probability, mass, and velocity. At Regensburg and Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe finally grasped a terrifying truth. They were no longer facing merely a rugged fighter, but a machine designed to turn mathematics into a weapon. The .850 caliber guns did not require perfect aim. They created a cloud of death where entering the zone was enough to ensure annihilation. This was the moment when the phrase, "850s rained lead," ceased to be metaphor and became a literal description of what now ruled the skies over Germany. As the battles were pushed higher and higher, a ruthless rule began to reveal itself. The higher the altitude, the stronger the P-47 became, and the higher the altitude, the weaker German aircraft grew. This was not a matter of pilot perception or anecdote. It was a direct consequence of engineering. Above 28,000 feet, where the air grew so thin that conventional engines began to suffocate, the Thunderbolt entered its ideal combat zone. The core of this advantage lay in its turbo supercharger system. Unlike German fighters, which relied on mechanically driven superchargers whose effectiveness dropped sharply above 25,000 feet, the P-47 used exhaust gases to compress incoming air before feeding it back into the engine. This allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain near full power at 30,000 feet and beyond. Meanwhile, the FW-190 and Bf-109 became increasingly sluggish. Engine response dulled, climb performance collapsed, and acceleration faded with every 1,000 feet gained. This disparity was not theoretical. On October 8, 1943, one of Germany's most accomplished fighter aces, an officer who had survived hundreds of air battles and amassed more than 200 victories, led an interception against American bombers at nearly 28,000 feet. At that altitude, his FW-190 was no longer the predator it had once been. The engine was gasping for air, maneuverability was severely degraded, and when P-47s dove on the formation from above 32,000 feet, the fight ended in seconds. The German aircraft exploded in midair. No parachute was seen. The death of a top-ranking ace sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. German high command was forced to launch an urgent investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The resulting report delivered to Göring was deeply unsettling. The Thunderbolt possessed a service ceiling exceeding 42,000 feet, dive speeds approaching the sound barrier, heavy armor protection, and a level of structural strength that made it extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Most alarming of all, it could dictate the altitude of combat. And at those altitudes, Germany had no answer. This moment shattered a long-standing myth. The Luftwaffe had believed that superior skill, experience, and refined aircraft design would always be enough to dominate the air. The P-47 proved otherwise. Against the Thunderbolt, even the finest German pilots could not survive when forced to fight on terms chosen by the enemy. The high sky was no longer a contested arena. It became the domain of the P-47 and a death zone for anyone who tried to challenge it. If the P-47 Thunderbolt had once been dismissed as a crude machine with poor climb performance, the decisive upgrade introduced in late 1943 erased that perception entirely. The arrival of the P-47 D-22 variant, equipped with a massive paddle blade propeller, nearly 13 feet in diameter, transformed the Thunderbolt from a rugged survivor into a fully realized nightmare in the skies over Europe. The new propeller was not merely larger, it featured broad blades that bit into the air far more aggressively than earlier designs. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The climb rate at sea level increased from roughly 2,200 feet per minute to nearly 3,000 feet per minute. Acceleration improved dramatically, allowing the P-47 to build energy faster, disengage more quickly, and, most importantly, no longer fall behind during the opening moments of combat. For German pilots, the change was deeply unsettling. Familiar tactics, diving attacks followed by a rapid climb away, suddenly stopped working. In combat diaries and after-action reports, bitter observations began to appear. The fat fighters have learned how to climb. Luftwaffe pilots discovered that disengaging was no longer easy. When they tried to pull up and escape, the P-47 followed. And when escape failed, the outcome was often described with the same blunt phrase: blown apart. But another factor, psychological as much as technical, began to spread fear. That factor was sound. The paddle blade propeller, with blade tips reaching supersonic speeds in many flight regimes, produced a deep rolling roar that carried for miles. It did not sound like a conventional aircraft engine. It sounded like sustained thunder echoing across the sky. German ground troops began to recognize it before they ever saw the aircraft. And when they heard it, they knew exactly what was coming. The name spread through German units, a kind of death thunder, a thunderclap, that signaled devastating firepower descending from above. That sound became the Thunderbolt's signature, a form of identification that required no visual contact. It marked the completion of a psychological transformation, from mockery to caution to genuine fear. With the paddle blade propeller, the P-47 was not just more powerful, it was more present. And when the sky itself began to vibrate with that thunderous roar, the Luftwaffe understood that the Thunderbolt was no longer an aircraft to be laughed at, but a warning that death was approaching at terrifying speed. When the P-47 Thunderbolt began carrying external fuel tanks, the air war entered an entirely new phase. The Thunderbolt's range now exceeded 1,000 miles, allowing it to escort American bomber formations deep into German territory, areas once considered safe havens for the Luftwaffe. This was not merely a technical improvement. It was a direct strike at the core of German air strategy. Previously, the Luftwaffe could afford to wait. German fighters would allow American bombers to pass beyond the limits of Allied escort, then attack once the U.S. fighters were forced to turn back for lack of fuel. With fuel tank-equipped P-47s, that gap vanished. Thunderbolts now stayed with the bombers. Above them, ahead of them, behind them, forming a dense protective screen. To reach the B-17s or B-24s, German pilots now had to fly straight through the P-47 escort wall. And doing so increasingly resembled a suicide mission. German formations pressed forward with the faint hope of surviving the first few seconds. But almost immediately, Thunderbolts rolled down from above like a metal avalanche. The fire they unleashed was no longer a series of short bursts. It was solid streams of flame, continuous and overwhelming, leaving the enemy no time to react. German aircraft were torn apart before they ever reached their intended targets. One German ace later recalled the moment vividly. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sky. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' 30 seconds later, no one was laughing." When the P-47s opened fire, all illusions disappeared. There were no prolonged contests of skill, only absolute domination. The psychological impact of these escort missions was devastating. German pilots understood that the sky no longer belonged to them. Every time they took off to intercept American bombers, they knew that before they even sighted their targets, they might already be facing Thunderbolts. Confidence eroded. Morale collapsed. Veteran pilots who had once faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without hesitation now felt tension the moment reports mentioned P-47s in the area. From that point forward, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting to gain air superiority. It was fighting simply to survive. And when an air force is forced into that mindset, control of the sky has already been lost. Once the skies were firmly in Allied hands, the P-47 Thunderbolt assumed a new role, and its destructive power multiplied exponentially. No longer just a fighter hunter, the Thunderbolt became a fighter bomber, a grinding machine designed to obliterate everything moving on the ground below. If the Luftwaffe had once contested control of the air, the German army now faced something even more terrifying. Concentrated firepower raining down directly onto its logistical lifelines. The first weapon in this new role was the Hawke 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. At low altitude, these rounds could punch through the thin armor of trucks, rail cars, and even many light armored vehicles, then detonate and ignite fuel, cargo, and personnel inside. A short burst was enough to turn an entire supply convoy into an inferno. But the Thunderbolt did not stop there. Later variants carried two 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb beneath the fuselage. A bomb load comparable to early war medium bombers. With the addition of 5-inch HVAR rockets, each P-47 became a flying artillery platform, delivering explosive power equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. In Normandy, German infantry accounts captured the scale of the terror. "They flew so low you could see the pilots' faces," one officer recalled. "The engines roared, the rockets screamed, and then came the hammering of the machine guns." 20 vehicles disappeared in a single pass. To the men on the ground, the P-47 was no longer a fighter. It was flying artillery, with the precision of a sniper. D-Day marked the peak of this transformation. More than 500 P-47s formed an impenetrable umbrella of firepower over the invasion beaches. Any German attempt to move toward the coast in daylight was crushed. The few units that tried to advance, whether by air or ground, were destroyed within minutes. The statistics from June tell the story clearly. Hundreds of locomotives, thousands of trucks, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, and countless horse-drawn transports were destroyed. The result was operational paralysis. The Wehrmacht was forced to move almost entirely at night, a clear sign that its ability to maneuver and resupply had been shattered. From that moment on, the P-47 was no longer merely a weapon of air superiority. It became a symbol of logistical destruction. And in modern warfare, destroying logistics is the shortest path to victory. While the P-47 Thunderbolt was crushing the Luftwaffe over Europe, another theater just as unforgiving was pushing aircraft and pilots to their absolute limits. The Pacific. This was a fundamentally different kind of air war. Vast distances, sparse airfields, brutal climate, and flight legs so long that even minor mistakes meant death. It was a battlefield that punished fragile aircraft. And once again, the Thunderbolt proved it was not built solely to fight Germany. NT. New Guinea. American P-47 units quickly discovered that the very qualities once mocked in Europe, its bulky airframe, radial engine, and rugged construction, became decisive advantages. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding a Thunderbolt unit in the region, developed tactics built around high-altitude attacks, diving speed, and overwhelming firepower. In one fierce engagement, Kirby and his flight shot down multiple Japanese aircraft in a single mission, demonstrating that the P-47 could fully adapt to an entirely different style of warfare. Japanese pilot reactions mirrored the shock once experienced by the Luftwaffe. Their 20mm cannon, previously lethal against early American fighters, proved largely ineffective against the Thunderbolt. P-47s absorbed hits and kept flying, while their return fire tore Japanese aircraft apart in seconds. The combination of extreme durability and devastating firepower left the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force without a viable counter. But the greatest challenge of the Pacific was not the enemy, it was distance. To solve this problem, the United States developed the P-47N variant, specifically designed for long-range operations, featuring wet wings with integral fuel tanks. Each wing carried more than 90 additional gallons of fuel, extending the Thunderbolt's range to approximately 2,350 miles. For the first time, a heavy single-engine piston fighter like the P-47 could escort B-29 superfortresses on ultra-long-range missions toward Japan. The strategic implications were profound. The P-47 was no longer a solution limited to the European theater. It became a foundation of long-range warfare, an aircraft rugged enough to survive, powerful enough to fight, and capable of crossing vast oceans. From the jungles of New Guinea to the skies over Japan, the Thunderbolt proved that its original design philosophy, strength, endurance, and sustained power, was not only correct, but global in scope. The appearance of the Mi-262 jet fighter seemed to signal the end of all propeller-driven aircraft. With a top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engine fighter, the Mi-262 was expected to reverse the air war in late 1944. On paper, a P-47 Thunderbolt should not have stood a chance. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought under real conditions. And under those conditions, the Thunderbolt still found ways to kill jets. American pilots quickly learned that the Mi-262 was not invulnerable at all times. There were two deadly moments for Germany's jet fighters: during takeoff and landing, and when attacked from altitude in a high-speed dive. Early jet engines had slow throttle response and poor acceleration at low speeds, leaving the Mi-262 especially vulnerable during the first and last minutes of each sortie. The Thunderbolt, with its superior dive speed and high-altitude performance, began waiting for jets at exactly those moments. On November 27, 1944. One of the most symbolic encounters of the war took place. A P-47 pilot spotted a Mi-262 flying at low altitude after departing its airfield. The Thunderbolt dove from above at extreme speed, approaching 500 miles per hour. Fast enough to close the gap with the German jet in seconds. Confident in his speed advantage, the Mi-262 pilot never recognized the danger until 850 caliber machine guns opened fire at effective range. The result was familiar. The jet disintegrated in mid-air. A new technological era did not protect it from the mathematics of firepower. At the same time, the United States introduced the ultimate Thunderbolt variant, the P-47M. This version was equipped with a water methanol injection system, allowing the engine to reach approximately 2,800 horsepower for short periods. Combined with refined aerodynamics and increased power, the P-47M could achieve around 470 miles per hour in level flight. An astonishing figure for a propeller-driven aircraft. It was deployed specifically to intercept Mi-262 jets and destroy V-1 flying bombs. In combat reports, P-47M pilots emphasized a simple truth. They did not need to outrun jets. They only needed to bring their guns onto the target. The Me-262 was fast but fragile. A single accurate burst from a Thunderbolt was enough to turn Germany's most advanced aircraft into fragments. This phase pushed the P-47's image to its evolutionary peak. A piston-engine fighter born out of fear in 1940 was still capable of confronting and defeating jet aircraft by late 1944. The Thunderbolt proved that in war, technology is not just about speed. It is about survivability, firepower, and the ability to impose the terms of combat. Even as the era changed, the P-47 remained a lethal and relevant weapon. If the P-47 Thunderbolt was the weapon in the sky, then American industry was the true killing blow. That reality was revealed with brutal clarity in the early hours of a January 1, 1945, during the Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's final, desperate attempt to reverse the air war. Nearly 900 German aircraft, including many of their remaining experienced pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. The objective was simple and ruthless: destroy American aircraft on the ground where they could not defend themselves. At several airfields, the initial strikes succeeded. Dozens of P-47s were destroyed or damaged while parked on the ramp. For German pilots, it was a rare moment of satisfaction. One captured pilot reportedly pointed at the burning Thunderbolts and sneered, "What do you think of that?" The American response became legendary. An Army Air Forces officer looked out toward the flight line, where maintenance crews were already dragging wrecked aircraft aside to clear space for replacements, and calmly replied, "Tomorrow we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" That single sentence captured the true nature of the war. Germany could destroy airplanes, but it could not replace trained men or lost time. The United States could. Over the course of the war, 15,083 P-47s were produced, more than any other American fighter. At peak output, Republic aviation factories completed one Thunderbolt every hour, operating around the clock. The Evansville, Indiana plant alone reached a production rate of 500 aircraft per month, and aircraft were only part of the system. Each P-47 sortie consumed thousands of rounds of ammunition. By mid-1944, American forces were firing tens of millions of .50 caliber rounds every month. Fuel consumption was even more staggering. The 9th Air Force alone burned tens of millions of gallons of aviation fuel per month, all of it shipped across the Atlantic by an unbroken logistical pipeline. Operation Bodenplatte ended in disaster for the Luftwaffe. They lost hundreds of aircraft, and more critically, pilots who could never be replaced. The Americans lost airplanes, and replaced them within days. From that moment on, the war was no longer a contest between individual fighter designs. It was a struggle between two systems of warfare. And in a war defined by production lines, fuel, ammunition, and training capacity, the outcome had been decided long before the final shots were fired. If industry was the backbone of American air power, then pilot training was the heart of that system. By the final stages of the war, the disparity in training between the United States and Germany had become impossible to overcome, and it was this gap that delivered the Luftwaffe the most decisive blow of all. From 1943 to 1944, the United States operated an unprecedented pilot training machine. Each year, approximately 30,000 pilots graduated from advanced training programs. A P-47 pilot entering combat typically logged around 400 flight hours, including extensive formation flying, live gunnery against towed targets, simulated air combat, instrument flying, and detailed systems training. They did not simply know how to fly, they knew how to fight. By contrast, by late 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a catastrophic training crisis. Fuel shortages, lack of training aircraft, and the loss of experienced instructors forced Germany to slash training programs in desperation. Many young pilots entered combat with fewer than 100 total flight hours. And in some cases, only a few dozen. They had never completed full live-fire gunnery training, never practiced complex tactical maneuvers, and in some cases were barely familiar with the aircraft they were expected to fly into battle. The difference became painfully clear in combat. American pilots entered engagements with doctrine drilled into muscle memory: maintain formation, hold altitude advantage, avoid unnecessary dogfights, strike quickly, then disengage. They understood both the strengths and limitations of the P-47, knowing when to dive and when to break off. Many German pilots, especially late-war replacements, reacted instinctively rather than tactically, losing formation, panicking under high-altitude attacks, and quickly finding themselves in fatal positions. Most importantly, the United States achieved what Germany could not. It combined quantity with quality. When a veteran pilot rotated out or was lost, his replacement was not an unprepared novice, but a thoroughly trained aviator familiar with modern air combat and backed by hundreds of flight hours. Germany no longer had that option. Every pilot lost represented a gap that could never be filled. Here, the opening argument of the story comes fully into focus. The United States did not win simply because it had more aircraft. It won because it fused numbers with training, production with preparation, machines with people. In a prolonged war of attrition, that imbalance could not be corrected. It could only grow wider until the opposing force collapsed entirely. By the end of the war, the transformation in the Luftwaffe's perception of the P-47 Thunderbolt had come full circle. The laughter that echoed over the skies of France in 1943 was gone, replaced by an enduring sense of dread that lasted until final collapse. Joseph Pips Priller, who had once mocked the Thunderbolt as a pregnant cow, was forced to admit in late-war interviews that the P-47 was the best fighter bomber ever built. Not merely because of its firepower, but because it represented something Germany could never match: unlimited production capacity. That fear did not exist only in briefing rooms or intelligence reports. It seeped into combat psychology itself. German military doctors documented a condition they called Jabo fever, a physical stress reaction triggered simply by reports that Thunderbolts were operating in the area. Veteran pilots who had once faced Spitfires or Yaks without hesitation now experienced anxiety at the mere sound of the deep, familiar roar from above. For ground troops, the thunder of a P-47 meant only one thing: find cover immediately or die within seconds. The final statistics turned that fear into undeniable fact. Thousands of German aircraft were destroyed in aerial combat, and thousands more were destroyed on the ground. Tens of thousands of trucks, horse-drawn vehicles, rail cars, and locomotives were obliterated, along with countless logistical targets. P-47 units alone flew. Hundreds of thousands of combat sorties. Dropped. Hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. Fired. Hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition. And launched tens of thousands of rockets. These were no longer the statistics of a single fighter aircraft. They were the footprint of an industrial war machine. Internal Luftwaffe assessment files captured the collapse in stark terms. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter. Low threat. December 1943. Firepower dangerous at high altitude. March 1945. Survival impossible in direct engagement. In 1985, at a reunion of former German and American fighter pilots, Adolf Galland, the former commander of Germany's fighter force, delivered the final verdict. We were wrong to laugh. The Americans had not tried to build a European fighter. They built an aircraft according to an American philosophy: survive first, deliver overwhelming firepower, and produce it in massive numbers. The 850 caliber Browning machine guns did more than shoot down enemy aircraft.